students. I wanted to do a quick video to explain some things about the lesson that may be a little difficult to understand, just hit some high points. The first thing I wanted to go over was the critical thinking question, number one. A lot of people who were writing their answers about somebody who had difficulty swallowing were automatically going right to a feeding tube. And I wanted you to think about some of the nutritional things that we could do before we would go to a feeding tube. So look back into your book and check that out, but there's some things that we could do, such as changing consistencies and things of food. Some definitions I wanted to go over briefly. I know all of you defined gavage and lavage. One way I remember gavage easily is gavage looks like the word garage. You put things into the garage. You put food by gavage into somebody. So gavage is putting something into that person. Lavage begins with an L. When you leave the garage, you're taking things out. And so that is one way I remember the difference between gavage and lavage. The other terms, decompression, I think that's easily remembered. Tamponade. Students often forget this one. Tampon is in the middle of it, and it controls bleeding. So I think that's an easy way to remember it. There are different types of tubes that were talked about in the book. The Ewald is usually an oral, and think about an oral tube is a really good one that we use for somebody who has overdosed or has poisoned themselves on something and we need to get things out. So it's a good bit larger diameter of a tube. The other tubes are a lot smaller. So if we're putting a nasogastric tube down, a Levin is this is a sample of a Levin. It has one lumen, meaning there is one hole, one channel through this whole tube that you can use. For a double lumen tube, such as your Salem sump, this is one that we use for decompression a lot. This one has two lumens. There are two channels in here. One that we use to pull, usually we pull things out of their stomach and into a canister on the wall, and then the other is for this vent, the vent. And then the feeding tubes, I didn't get them out, but they tend to be a lot smaller diameter, so you will see a guide wire that needs to be used, and also that they tend to be weighted in order to ease the insertion. Just remember, with a guide wire tube, you cannot take that wire out and then put it back in. You have to make sure you're done with it before you take that wire out. The other thing I wanted to talk to you about is when you have a patient who has a nasogastric tube, say you're at the hospital and you're doing clinical and your patient has a nasogastric tube and you're doing your assessment, you need to remember that when you're doing your physical assessment, if you're listening to bowel sounds, you need to turn the suction off to that nasogastric tube, because if you're listening and you're hearing the sucking sound, it will sound like bowel sounds. So turn the suction off, or you want to disconnect it for a little bit until you make sure you have that assessment done. The other thing I recommend is if you're taking a patient, say they're ambulatory and you can take them to the bathroom and you have to disconnect the suction for a little bit to get them into the bathroom, make sure you leave the suction on the wall running, because that gurgling sound occasionally on that wall will remind you to hook them back up when they come back to the bed. And you're thinking, how will I disconnect? Well, a lot of times for a decompression type nasogastric tube, you will have this Salem sump. And this came apart, but basically you have this little pigtail vent and you have this little piece that can be put in the end of that, and then you just disconnect it from the tubing that's going to the wall and plug it, and then you will take them to the bathroom. The one thing you need to remember with a nasogastric tube or any kind of tube, if it's hanging from the nose, you don't want it just dangling there. Even if it's taped on, we want to make sure it's secured to the gown. You just don't put a pin through the tube, you put tape on and then secure it with the tape. The thing I want you to remember is knowing your feeding routines that are in the book: the bolus feeding, the intermittent feeding, the cyclic, and the continuous. Which one provides the most risk for aspiration and which is the safest one? Know the risk and benefits of all of those. And also, when you're getting ready to do a feeding, what are the steps that you need to do? An important thing is knowing to check for gastric residual and the amount of gastric residual that is safe. Your book talks about 100 milliliters or 20% of the last hour's feeding. That is for an adult. Remember, if you have a child, it may be different, so you need to consult your physician. The other part I want you to really pay attention as well is how do you troubleshoot problems with a tube. Nurses have to do that all the time, and so paying attention to that part of the chapter is super, super important. If the client vomits, if they have diarrhea, if they're having constipation, if the tube clogs, what do you need to do? It's really, really important to know that if you're using a tube as a feeding tube and you're putting things in, you're using gavage, putting things into that tube, that you've had that x-ray to double check placement. We would never, ever, ever put anything down a tube that has not been confirmed by x-ray. And then you also want to make sure whenever you're doing a feeding that you always start with water and end with water so you prevent clogging. If you end with the feeding and you don't flush the tube, you'll clog the tube. And know your different types of feeding. Just know that maybe a patient who had trauma or burns might need to increase protein solution feeding. A patient who is on dialysis may need a special type feeding. A diabetic patient may need a consistent carb feeding that controls blood glucose. So look the different types of feedings up that would be possible. And review all of the procedures at the end of the chapter. I would highly recommend making a step-by-step guide on index cards to help guide you and help you remember. Thanks for listening, and I hope that was helpful.